Good morning, everybody, and thank you to the distinguished speakers before, setting the stage perfectly for what we're about to explore today and talk about. I think I saw a hint of modesty about the green building industry in Malaysia. I got the pleasure to read this book last night, and it lays out the case about greening Malaysia and has some amazing case studies around what's actually been done on the ground here. So I think that's a really good start, and lots of capacity and good case studies to build from. What I want to talk about today is the case for sustainable buildings or green buildings, why we're doing it, what's the drivers behind it, what do certain organizations do, and how do they evaluate, see the value in what they're doing and delivering green buildings. Am I talking too straight into it? So I think looking at green buildings or sustainable buildings, you can largely look at it in four categories. So about environment, that's obvious, green buildings, environment, but it's also about people and how the buildings affect people. It's about resilience, it's about cost and efficiency and resource efficiency. So there's a lot of aspects around green buildings. And the magnitude was touched on before. Green buildings or buildings overall are responsible for a big part of the global greenhouse gas emissions, produce a lot of waste, and less than optimal buildings also have a huge impact on human productivity and human health. We see lots of losses from extreme weather events where we build inappropriate buildings in the wrong places, and they get damaged and they're brittle to a changing and harsh environment. And we're also seeing the energy sector as a big energy consumption source as well. But there are solutions. So we've seen from examples in Australia where we have a green rating tool called Green Star that green buildings can dramatically drive down greenhouse gas emissions. Healthier buildings, better ventilation can significantly increase the productivity and cognitive functions of occupants and deliver business value. We see that green buildings attract a premium. They're worth more. They're more attractive as investments and purchase offers. However, when we look at the resilience, I think that's a big unknown. How well prepared are we to a changing climate, to a 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees change? I think there's less case studies and less optimism around the adaptation of the built environment. Now, everyone knows who this girl is. Hands up if you know who she is. Okay, keep your hands up if you can pronounce her name. So this is my fellow Swedish Greta Thunberg. So she's 16 years old, and she's driving climate action around the globe. And she gets to speak at the United Nations, at the international negotiations, at the European Union. She gets invited to talk to politicians, except in one country, her own. She's not yet spoken to the Swedish government. Maybe because she sat outside protesting and to get this started. We have a massive international consensus on action to climate change, which was described earlier. We need to take action, we need to do something. And to see this trickle down from the G20, so the major economies in the world say, well, now this needs to be disclosed. If we're going to make financial investment decisions, we need to know about the exposure to climate change, both from what are the metrics for this organization, what's their approach to managing the risk of carbon, of energy transition, of reputational risk, physical risk and physical change, what's the strategy and what the governance structure around that. This is a framework that's being adopted very broadly around leading organizations as this is what investor wants to see. And taking a look in Australia, and 5-10 years ago, you tried to tell people in the C-suite at the directors level to take green buildings seriously, to take climate change seriously. They looked at it, well, I have a sustainability manager managing that for me. That conversation has changed a lot over the last couple of years. Now it's a board issue because it's a director's responsibility to be proactive, transparent, and clear about what actions they're taking. It's clearly a director's task to look after this and add to this the framework and the expectations from investors, what they want to see. So this is no longer an operational aspect. This is very much a strategic business risk and obligation. Yeah. And what does this mean in terms of real change. So we're on a trajectory right now with the top bar where we have actually increasing emissions globally. We emit 40 gigatons per year, and with current policies and actions, it's going to increase. But what the international agreement is that we need to drive that drastically down to zero in the next 30 to 50 years in order to limit global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees. So when we say 1.5 to 2 degrees, that's what we mean, a carbon neutral economy in our lifetime. And that's going to be across everything, the buildings, the transportation, communication, clothes, food, absolutely everything. So it's a massive transition we're ahead of. And whilst we have an international agreement, and on a personal level we feel like this is something we need to take seriously, what do you do as an organization? Sure, we know that governments have committed to this, but as an organization, as a commercial entity, what do I need to do? Based on this, there was born the Science-Based Target Initiative. So that's a response to providing a method and a framework for organizations to say, well, I have a climate strategy and a path to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. And what that looks like is that each sector has their own trajectory and path based on the least cost to adapt and to get on the low carbon economy. So this is the Science-Based Target Initiative, is what companies, depending on which sector they're in, can align their emission profile and targets to. And this has been going on for probably 2-3 years now. There's almost 600 companies joining this, and if you can read the screen, you see there's some really big corporates that signed up to this and committed to targets. It's a global movement, and it is an opportunity for organizations to say, well, I'm doing my bit ahead of carbon tax and regulation. So it's a voluntary initiative. And the targets, what they look like is, for example, we have Frasers Property in Australia. They committed to, in order for us to be on par with this decarbonisation, we need to reduce the carbon intensity per square meter. But if you read their target formulation, it's also around their supply chain and their tenants. So they're going outside their organizational boundary and say, we're also going to take ownership and commit to what our suppliers do of building materials, tenants operating our spaces. NL, which is a power company, say we're going to decarbonize and we're actually going to go carbon neutral, which is quite amazing for a largely fossil fuel driven organization. And Walmart, they will do what they do with their stores and fleets, but significantly they will decarbonize their supply chain. They committed to 1 gigaton to remove from their supply chain, which means that they need to work collaboratively with the likes of Unilever, Johnson & Johnson, Nestle to achieve this target. And having worked with 2 of the companies here, I know that none of them are doing it to lose money. They have these strategies and they're making money doing it. So it's a commercially attractive offer to decarbonize. Rating tools. Again, in Australia, we have Green Star. It's the equivalent of LEED or BREEAM. And they say, if we're going to lead the green building sector into this low carbon economy, we're not going to certify any buildings beyond 2030 if they're not carbon neutral. And if you want to have the highest rating, a 6-star rating, you have to be carbon neutral within a few years. Otherwise, you won't be able to get the highest rating. So they're dramatically leading the charge. When they went out to industry to consult, is this enough? How does this feel? Is this feasible? A lot of industry said, you have to drive this harder. This is not too hard. You have to challenge us and push us even further. If you look at a building, I'm sure we're all aware that most of the life cycle emissions and energy is from the operational side. So it's running the buildings over decades. And that's where the focus has been a lot, about improving the energy efficiency, driving down operational energy. And the materials and construction impacts haven't seen as that significant contributor to the energy footprint and greenhouse gas emissions. But that's changing. So now, rationally, we have focused a lot on operational energy to ventilate and light the buildings, etc. But fast forward a few years ahead, it's going to be more and more about the materials, the products, the closed loop, the recyclability of materials. So that's a new challenge which we're not really prepared for, in my experience and opinion. Now, if we look at some of these key materials and look at the footprint they have, so concrete, for example, we use a huge amount of concrete over our life. There's about 70 cubic meters of concrete produced for each and every one of us here over life to support our living in buildings and the roads we drive on, sanitation, etc. And it's responsible for a big part of the global carbon footprint. Same with steel. We use massive amounts of steel over our lifetime, and again, a very big energy and greenhouse gas contributor. Timber, I'm amazed by this number that there's 100 square meters of land, of forest cleared for everyone on the planet to sustain all the fiber and timber we need over life. Plastic, I know there's going to be a discussion later on. Massive amounts of plastic is used. We have single-use plastic, we have ocean pollution. It's a massive issue. Food, we consume about 35 tons of food over our life, and we waste enormous amounts of this, about 30% just wasted. And we use 70% of the water in the world to produce this food, which ends up largely in the bin. Cotton, the clothes, we use about 260 kilograms per person over our life, and 1 kilogram of cotton can use as much as 20,000 liters of water. So all these embodied impacts, what sits behind the products and the energy, the coal that we consume, the unsafe labor practices to mine the coal, this is largely uncosted in what we're producing, these externalities. And if we put it together, the backpack, if you will, the amount of materials that we accumulate over life, and put ourselves on the same scale, this is just a sample of materials that's produced on our benefit. And it's largely unsustainable, especially with population growth. We're getting more and more, we're increasing the prosperity and the material use of our lives. And we haven't yet decoupled. Material and resource use is increasing, almost exponentially. So it's a huge challenge in that space as well. And I think in Australia, specifically, and also in the US, we woke up to this a year or two ago with a national sword in China saying, we're not going to take your waste anymore. You have to deal with it. And it exposed the industries and companies how unprepared they were to deal with the end of life of their products. All of a sudden, there's this massive transition, and there's an endless list of every jurisdiction in Australasia at the moment is looking at circular economy policies, grant programs. How do we get the recycling industry up? What does this look like? What's the metrics? It's a big scramble on how to deal with the resource loop. So if you say that energy, we largely figured out how to optimize energy in buildings. We know what success look like. Materials is less explored. Circular economy is a concept where it's not just about recycling, it's about eliminating the need to recycle in the first place. Dematerialize, sell services, not products. Don't build your business model on churn of materials, take ownership of it, close the loop. A lot of successful companies are doing this, and they're making money doing it as well. We have from several sectors, Airbnb, Uber, those type of organizations are largely circular economy businesses by definition. IKEA, again, doing the Swedish theme here, they're thinking about being a circular economy company by 2030, which means that they can no longer just sell stuff. They need to lease it, they need to own it and take responsibility for the end of life. In the construction sector, if you look at the materials going into the structural application, concrete, timber, steel, we're not doing very well. Concrete is largely, after we're done with the building, we crush it up and maybe we recycle it, but we downcycle it into road base or some lower level application. Most of the timber simply ends up in landfill, decomposing into methane to a large degree. And steel looks pretty good because it looks like it's recycled. But recycling steel is almost as energy intensive and polluting as producing it in the first place. So it's all about reuse. And if you look at circularity and reuse in the economy and in the construction sector, it's a far way off. It's not nearly there. So how should we deal with this? Life cycle assessment is one of those tools that look at this to say, holistically, we need to future-proof by looking at the whole life cycle, all stages, and also all relevant environmental impacts. Let's just not optimize on greenhouse gas emissions. Let's look at other pollutants, resources, and water, and find the overall optimized solution over the life of a product or an asset. And this is what's being done. The green building rating tools, such as LEED, BREEAM, Green Star, etc., they're doing this. They have life cycle assessments as a big part of the way they certify and they drive the rating tools forward. The product sector, you have life cycle assessment declarations, environmental product declarations, which allows the manufacturers to say, this is the embodied impact of my product. this is how you should dispose or recycle it at the end of life to tell their life cycle story. So you have these jigsaw puzzle pieces coming up so you can start looking at the whole picture of buildings using life cycle assessment. So business case. One of my favorite business cases is actually from the infrastructure sector. Some work we did with the government department in New South Wales around Sydney in Australia. They were building a rail line, so called the Southwest Rail Line, south of Sydney. And they have a rating tool or design guidelines. They call it the Sustainable Design Guidelines, where they say you have to achieve a certain rating for this as part of the contract. Whether it's gold, platinum, or silver, it's in the contracts for the contractors to deliver on. And the board of directors at Transport said, we had this in place for a few years now, but how much money are we sinking into this sustainability thing that we're requiring on all our infrastructure projects? Can someone please have a look at this and see what the, as they framed it, was what the waste of money was? So they wanted to know the value of actually demanding a gold or a platinum rated piece of infrastructure. So we looked at the 3 different scenarios for building this rail line. One would be the business as usual, doing nothing, just optimize on the lowest capex, upfront cost. Doing slightly better, so do a bronze-rated building where they probably, or piece of infrastructure where they essentially do half of the sustainability initiatives available, or go all in, do as many, cram in as much sustainability as you possibly can, green materials, energy efficiency, etc. So let's look at the business case or the value proposition for doing this. And looking at the cost, and now we're looking at the upfront cost of building this rail line, the operational cost, the maintenance cost over the full life, and then discounting that back to net present value. You can see that the more sustainability you put in, there is a capex uplift. You pay more money up front, but you have a lower operations and maintenance cost. And actually it comes out quite evenly. They're pretty much the same. It's a fraction of a % difference. But that's not telling the whole story. This is the financial business case only. If you apply an environmental lens on this and look at the life cycle emissions of greenhouse gas emissions, of toxic pollutants, etc., that ultimately will affect the environment and indirectly us. If you put that into the business case as well and say, let's just look at the emissions and impacts that actually affects human beings, let alone the environment around us. And then put a value on that to try to quantify that. So the metric for this is often called disability adjusted life years. So it's essentially from this environmental degradation, what's the loss of productivity or life of the communities around us? And we can measure this degradation. So if there's lots of poor air quality, air pollution in the urban environment, it will affect people's health. They will lose sick days to work. They will go to hospitals. You have to have more hospital beds, more nurses, etc. We can measure that, and we can also put a dollar value on it. So every year lost to disability or injury or poor health is worth something. It's worth about $50,000. That's the value of taking someone off a healthy and productive life. And if we look at this rail line and see what's the health benefits delivered using this framework, you can see that the platinum infrastructure saved about, or will save about 1,000 disability adjusted life years over its operation. Make that part of the business case, because this is funded by taxpayers' money. If you have a very polluting piece of asset there, and you have to build more hospital beds to accommodate for it, and you lose economic output, it should be part of the equation. Putting that in as a line item, and you can see that building that platinum infrastructure was 5% cheaper. So investing that capex up front, creating a cleaner piece of infrastructure, will save taxpayers 5% of the cost. Now the board of directors looking at this turned completely around, saying, well, that's interesting. Now we do that on every infrastructure project in the state over $50 million. So they're mandating a sustainability rating of infrastructure of all projects. So it went from being negative to positive once you've been able to put some measure of economics behind it. And the way industry is responding to this is that they're putting in tenders. This is a tender submission to a Northwest Railing, so a big $9 billion project north of Sydney, where one of the contractors said, well, we understand what you're saying. We're going to provide value in terms of optimizing or minimizing environmental impact. We know we're going to have to produce materials, dig stuff off the ground, run trucks to get this infrastructure going. We will do it mindful of minimizing environmental impact and building it to optimize the environmental performance over life. We will do it minimizing cost and optimizing social value. So the triple bottom line, and not just day one, but over the whole operations of this asset. So this is what their tender submission looked like. This is what we're going to do. They changed their mindset from an economic case, low risk, to creating value on the triple bottom line. Now we can scale this up even further. This is a project looking at a greenfield city in China, and essentially a high-tech city, 1.5 million people, a satellite city to Shenzhen. And if that city would have been built the same way, business as usual, you would have locked in a life cycle emissions of 600 million tons of carbon dioxide. That's approximately the same quantum of emissions that we have in Australia per year overall. Now, if you apply some sensible initiatives, you do more green buildings, certify them to a higher LEED standard, you do district cooling and heating, take cars off the road, etc., you can essentially reduce emissions by 58%. And put a health perspective on that, you will save 2.5 million working days by building a more sustainable city. For the companies that they were trying to attract here, the big IT and tech companies, this is real productivity, this is leverage and competitive advantage. Now, it's easy to get lost in the assets, the buildings, the technology. When we think about it, the business case is really about people. We're building buildings for people, for the productivity, the output, the function we want out from it. And Colin Powell said it in his own way. It's about people. It's not about the building. It's not about the plans, the strategies that needs to be there. But ultimately, we need to optimize around the human beings. And considering the life cycle economic case, if you will, a building is going to be standing for 40, 50, 60 years. We're going to spend a little bit upfront to build it, that's for sure. It's going to be expenditure for rent and operational costs for energy. But most of the cost that's going to be for this building is going to be around the people, the salaries you're going to pay, the benefits for the people occupying the building. So the building should be built to make sure you optimize on the people using the building. And there's a few simple techniques that's been proven over and over again. So for example, providing outside views. And I know Sam will talk about this more, so I won't steal your thunder, but there's a clear improvement in the productivity by simply providing outside views. It's no technology really, it's just a design feature. Daylighting, same. There's been a number of cases showing that you get better health, better productivity, better outputs from simply letting in some light. And well-certified buildings have been proven to reduce absenteeism, staff turnover. People like to work in these buildings. And again, this is clearly hitting the bottom line for organizations to build buildings for people, optimizing on health and well-being. And we see the global real estate industry is increasing. It's multi-billion, 180 billion projected by 2022. And this is because businesses see benefits in providing buildings for people. And there's been endless studies on the business case for green buildings, and there's a different perspective if you're an owner, if you're an investor, if you're a developer. You'll have different value propositions. Some of these will coincide. I think the business case for green buildings was talked about a lot 5-10 years ago, and you rarely hear it anymore. People take it as there is a business case, it's the right thing to do. It's often to bridge the split incentive, to overcome investing and building in a premium building that someone else is going to reap the benefits from higher productivity, to connect those two agendas. That's the challenge. I don't think anyone looking at the studies, looking at the merits and the common sense in building more sustainable and greener buildings, it's clearly there. It's around building the business case around it. And part of that is changing the language. So Green Star has been around in Australia, the green rating tool, for 15 years, more or less. And now they're doing a massive revamp of the tool. And one of the things they're doing is they're changing the language from indoor environment, quality, transport, energy, emissions, to positive framing. So being responsible, positive, regenerative, being around place, being around people, because it's all about creating value. It's not about minimizing something bad, it's about creating the value for the environment, for the economy, and for people. And I think the conclusion to this is that it is common sense. I think we all recognize a green building, a sustainable building, when we see it. We know it's lower operating costs. We know it's better for the occupants. We know it's overall a better asset. And it's more around how can we align values and incentives and opportunities around this. Because at the end of the day, it's not doing something we don't know how to do. It's simply provide the carrot, the frameworks, and the methodologies for achieving it. And I believe some of the following speakers will talk a lot about the way we can align this and the way we can develop these tools and incentives. Thank you.